Hey everybody, it's Michael from the Watch Preserve, and welcome to the Timelines podcast. On today's episode, my guest and I talk about modern versus vintage dive watch design, diving in French Polynesia, and dream dive watches on dream dive locations. Let's get into it. Hello everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of the Timelines podcast presented by the Watch Preserve. My guest today is a watch collector, photographer, avid scuba diver, and when he's not correcting the colors that we see on film and television, you might see him underwater taking pictures of some amazing watches on his dive trips for Monochrome watches. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the show, Mr. Derek Haager. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
It's my pleasure, man. I'm excited to kind of sit down and talk to you really about what you do, because it's so interesting to me as a watch enthusiast and as a diver myself. As a bit of a background, we met kind of briefly on a recent watch/scuba trip out in South Florida. We were diving Blue Heron Bridge and some other stuff around there.
Limited success.
Limited success. We were supposed to be doing way more dives, and the weather just wasn't cooperating. But only so much you can do, right? But we didn't get a whole lot of time to talk on that trip. It's difficult to communicate underwater.
Sure.
But I'm really curious to kind of delve into your past as a watch enthusiast, but really talk about what you do for a living, which I think is super interesting, and then what you do in the watch space, which is very cool. But as a bit of background for people that don't have the privilege of knowing you already, could you just real quick kind of give us a rundown, I guess, how you got into watches in the first place, into this space? Because everybody has their own unique kind of origin story, and there's a lot of similarities, but it's unique, I think, to each individual. So did you grow up wearing watches on your wrist all the time, or did you kind of come to it later in life?
I mean, pretty much my whole life, but I was, as a kid, most of my childhood was in the 80s, which is aging myself a little. But it was all Casio watches all the time. So my whole childhood was like Hasbro and Casio, pretty much, like Transformers and digital watches. So I always had like a slew of the F91s and a bunch of the data banks, that can hold like 100 different phone numbers in them, if you can imagine a number that high. Even though like the only phone numbers I knew were my mom.
Yeah, right.
Because I'm like 6 years old.
Using it to 1/100th of its capacity.
Yeah. So lots of those. And then when I graduated to being a teenager, Swatch watches were all the rage. So I had to have a couple of Swatch watches. And then I kind of just stayed with digital watches up until probably my like mid-20s is when I started to like learn that there were even such a thing as mechanical watches through like a buddy of mine that had somehow gone down the rabbit hole as well. And that was where the interest in mechanical watches came. And then from there, the interest in diving watches, because I grew up in Florida, but I didn't grow up diving, but I did grow up like around water and boats. And so there's definitely like a maritime bent to my interests. So got interested in dive watches, and then it feels like it's the same story that everybody has, or at least more than a few people have, is like started to wear these watches and we're like, well, I feel like kind of a poser if I'm wearing these watches and not diving. So now we gotta go figure out how to scuba dive. It's weird that I never did before growing up in Florida, where you're just surrounded by water and divers or whatever, but it just never came up, It's like if I'd had one friend who was in it or one family member, like I probably would have been diving for 30 years now, but it just never happened.
Yeah, it's funny, like the different periods of time in which you come to these things. Like I grew up very much inland and here in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas, and I distinctly remember, because there was always one dive shop that was close to, when I was in high school, I did like dual credit classes at a community college to knock out some basics for school. And there was a dive shop right nearby. And, my dad dove a little bit when he was in college, but never really talked about it. It didn't have any pictures or anything like that. And so I remember always passing that dive shop thinking, man, I wonder what goes on in there, but it's pretty interesting. So like you say, in a way you kind of start wearing the dive watches, and then it's always in the back of your head, right? You know, it's like, well, I could take this underwater. I could go diving with this. So for me,
Mm-hmm.
kind of similar to you, it was the watches were sort of the ends to the means of getting into that dive space. But there's a lot of similarities,
Yeah.
I think, you know, when you get into like dive watches and tool watches. And I know, for example, you mentioned to me before we started recording that you were tinkering with VCRs and things like that in the garage when you were growing up, right? And I think that there's
Sure.
a lot of that kind of gearhead, if you will,
Yeah.
similarity about
Yeah.
people that like mechanical things, like tinkering and you know, fiddling about with mechanics and stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that also I think fit like diving fits nicely in that same sort of gear centric thing
Yeah.
that we all seem to share.
But for you,
It's interesting how many people though share that kind of same story. Like I had a dive watch, and then I was like, well, I guess I got to go diving.
yeah.
So it's like it's a very niche thing. It seems like,
But it creates like
but
it's like just layers of interest, right? Like you can be passionate
yeah,
about diving, but if you take that passion for watches, it doesn't even need to be like a specifically watch related passion. It could just be a passion for tools, for the history of things. I had a customer, a gentleman, come into the store the other day who was looking for a dive watch for his son because his son is a scuba diver, and he was like, well, I don't know a whole lot about diving. Like, do people even use these? And I was like, well, no, like you're not using a dive watch the way you would have in the 1960s, but
mm,
it's sort of that romanticized aspect of honoring the past, right? Of saying this is where
yeah,
recreational diving was, you know, 50, 60 years ago, and sort of, you know, cosplaying, I guess, if you will, a little bit, you know,
a little bit.
yeah, of good days gone by, right?
Mm-hmm. Did the guy get it?
He did, yeah. I sold him a little
Yeah,
vintage Baylor skin diver, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. It's pretty cool."
nice,
Um,
nice. You got another. You got
yeah.
another one.
So for you though, I guess the tinkering sort of led to other routes, right? Because you wanted to be an audio engineer for a while, right? So again, layers
Yes.
of technical stuff and detail, right?
Yeah, yeah. I guess it's pretty much just a lifelong thing of just being interested in mechanics and electronics and yeah, it's just never ending. It
Yeah.
seems.
So how did you go from audio engineer to colorist?
So I went to college in Florida and got a degree in audio engineering. And I grew up playing in bands, and I was a DJ for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and just various music adjacent things. And that seemed like a career path that I was interested in because my brother and I had also in the garage and sometimes the living room, but we set up like a small recording studio.
Yeah.
We had like a reel to reel 8-track and
Oh, sick.
mics and all this sorts of stuff. So it seemed like a natural progression to try to go into that as a career. So moved to New York City right after college
Mm-hmm.
and started trying to get work at like the big recording studios with limited success. I had some internships, but nothing that really ever panned out into like full time work because I don't have any data to back this up, but it felt like this was the exact time. This was like the early 2000s when the whole recording industry was making like a transition to not giant multi-million-dollar studios with mixing desks as long as half a football
Mm-hmm.
field or whatever, into more of like the bedroom laptop type recording
Oh
thing.
yeah.
So everybody was basically downsizing. I know a couple of the studios that I had internships at were closed within like a year. So it was like a weird transition period, and for me at least, fresh out of college, it felt like it was a lot harder to get my foot in the door.
Sure.
So I started working part-time jobs. I worked at Starbucks for a while. I was a FedEx driver for a while. Um, and then a buddy of mine from college got me a job at CBS Sports. So working on the NFL Today live show, which is like the show that comes on before football games, just as like a assistant, like a production assistant.
Yeah.
And then from there, I was introduced to editing and the video side of stuff, and I was like, "Oh wow, this is like almost more interesting than I found the audio stuff." So I did some courses on editing, and then became an assistant editor, and I did that for a long time, and then I was an editor for a while, and then I was introduced to color correction, and then I focused on that, and the rest is history.
So is color correction what I assume it is? You know, they'll be filming and you'll get that raw footage and correct it to what? Is there like a color spectrum you use, or is it to the director's taste about how they want to color grade what they're looking at, or?
It really kind of depends on what the project is and what the final product is meant to be. So if it is like a film or a TV commercial or something, it's very stylistic or artistic, and you know how you see all sci-fi movies are like blue and green and have that very cool like hue. It's doing all that because none of that stuff is done in camera. But when you're working on like television shows, my company does a lot of reality TV, so it's a lot of trying to fix, let's say, errors that happen in the shooting process, and like mismatched cameras. You know, if you're shooting, because these reality shows they work on a very like run and gun pace.
Oh yeah,
you know,
sure.
because they're just following random people around. So they'll have 5 different cameras, and they're all, you know, the lighting's different. They go from inside to outside. Everything gets blown out. Blah blah blah. So it's basically fixing those things and also trying to like match everything into a cohesive package, so it's not jarring when the edit goes from one camera to another.
Sure.
And stuff like that.
And that eye that you have then probably pretty seamlessly kind of translates into watch photography, right? I mean, when you said kind of, you know, the multiple cameras where, you know, one's blown out or, you know, the lighting is different. I mean, watches, as we all know, are notoriously difficult to shoot, and every watch is kind of different. So in a way, you know, if you're shooting a flat crystal or a domed crystal or, you know, a lighter dial or darker dial, in a sense, that's just kind of an extension almost of your day job, right? Color correcting and making sure your photos look uniform, especially on the trips where you're shooting in kind of unpredictable conditions,
Yeah, it's definitely come into it. I know there have been some trips where I've shot 2 different underwater cameras, and underwater photography, as I'm sure you've tinkered with at least,
a little bit,
is notoriously harder than I think above water photography. So especially like 2 different camera systems under there is just a nightmare. But I think my job skills do come in a bit handy.
Does it change the way that you look at watches? Like, have you ever seen a watch come out from a producer and you're like, wish they went a different blue, you know? Like do your sensitivities for the visual aspects of it kind of translate to your personal tastes in watches?
That's a good question. I don't know. I not consciously, but possibly in the subconscious somewhere there's a thing. I know that I have in the past couple of years become like overly sensitive probably to the polish of a watch, so to the point where like any watch that has like a super polished finish, I'm like, nah, that's too shiny for me. Maybe that's from trying to take photos of them being like, this thing's too shiny.
maybe
But yeah, I don't know.
Some of the hardest things for me to shoot here at the store are pocket watches, because they were made to be sometimes as mirror like a surface as possible. And you hit this kind of this point, and I'm sure you've hit this with some things too, where you try different lighting, different situations, and then after too long of a time trying to shoot it, you say, you know what, is what it's going to be. You hit that point where there's only so much you can do.
Yeah. I've considered before, like, you know, going even deeper into it when you can't fix that reflection, and then like, well, what if I shot the dial, you know, in a light box or something where I can control every aspect of the lighting, and then Photoshop the dial into this other photo.
Yeah.
Oh my god. Yeah. That seems like too much work. And then is that disingenuous? I think that's a whole different conversation.
Sure. I guess this is as good a time of any to talk about really what you do in the watch space, which is awesome.
Okay.
It's kind of like, I mean, for me anyways, that's sort of just like a dream job. You know, you're getting these opportunities to go to sometimes far-flung places with very cool watches and dive and take pictures of these stories and write up watches. But probably what a lot of people don't realize is how full time of a job that is content creation and everything, because you can't always just enjoy a scuba dive, right? You have to always think about when you want to shoot a watch, you know, in what conditions, whether it's, you know, at depth or at a safety stop or whatever. I'm maybe getting ahead of myself just because I want to talk about it. So you do content, you write content for Monochrome Watches, which is a huge online watch publication. But before
Yeah.
that, you wrote for Scottish Watches, right?
Yes, correct.
So
You
how
want
did
me to
so?
tell that
Oh
story?
yeah, please, yeah. Because I actually didn't know you wrote for Scottish Watches, until just beforehand. So how did you get into that space? Because it's a very niche sort of thing to do, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I had like a loose. I'd spent some time reading Hodinkee and the blog to watch through through my travels of figuring out mechanical watches, and I had some idea that that it was a job that people had to just write about watches through listening to like early episodes of Grey NATO and hearing other people discuss it.
Mm,
And it really came from, as a lot of people's like odd career paths did, it came from the pandemic. So we all ended up at home with a lot more time on our
yeah.
hands, and I'm trying to remember how the timeline actually worked, but I think actually it might have been right before the pandemic. Somehow I'd been like communicating with the Scottish Watches guys just through Instagram, through Instagram comments or whatever, and built up like a pseudo friendship as
Yeah.
you do through Instagram. So I had a trip planned to Scotland for a family event, and I scheduled it so that a watch that I had bought a few months before from Anordane, the Scottish brand,
Mm-hmm.
that instead of them shipping it to me, I was just going to go by and pick it up and like take a little tour of their facility and whatnot. So that was great. And then I talked to the Scottish Watches guys, and they had been looking for like people to write more website content because they were primarily focused on the podcast.
Sure.
So they were like, "Yeah, you want to write up a review of that Dan Dane?" And I was like, I guess I'll give that a shot. And I'd never really written anything professionally at all, but barely even as a hobbyist
Mm.
before. So I took a stab at it, and they seemed to like it enough that they asked me to do some more. And I did that for probably about a year, and then that through all the pandemic I did more of that because I had more free time. And they also had a few like YouTube things they were doing, and like live Zoom shows they tried to do
Oh,
for a
cool. Yeah.
while. So we were doing all that sort of stuff through the pandemic. And then after probably about a year and a half, I was like, this seems to be going okay. So maybe I'd try to like step up my game a little bit. No offense to Scottish Watches, but to try to maybe play with the little bigger boys.
Yeah.
So yeah, I reached out to Monochrome and just asked them if they would be interested in doing some dive stories, because I also did more scuba diving during the pandemic, weirdly, but that was when I started like getting all the extra certifications and
Mm-hmm.
whatnot. So I was diving more. I was like, I'd probably tie this together and do some dive watch stories. And not too many people are doing that. You
Yeah.
had your Jason Heaton,
Of
obviously,
course.
and I don't even know who else was doing it at that point.
Cole did a couple. I think Cole Pennington
Yeah,
with the
yeah,
Grand
yeah,
Seiko. Yeah.
yeah. But I was like, this is really niche. So I pitched it to Monochrome. Didn't hear back from them for probably like 6 months. So I was like,
Okay.
I guess they're not interested. And then just out of the blue one day, they were like, "Hey, we got your email," and then we went from there. And I think the very first watch they arranged for me to meet with a publicist in New York City and pick up a Tutuma,
Okay.
the German brand,
Yeah.
which I had never had any experience before. So we went out to a rock quarry, me and my dive buddy, and out in Pennsylvania, and did the best we could with the entry level underwater camera that I'd picked up a couple weeks before,
Yeah.
and it turned out okay. And then just been doing it from there. It is like, as you said, it seems like a dream job, but I don't. At least for me, it's not possible to do it enough to have it be my full time job,
Oh
because it
yeah.
does involve a lot of travel and a lot of it is kind of just a lot of work. And you do get to a point where you're just not really you get back from a dive trip and be like, well, what did I really do? Like, I just looked at watches underwater for a couple hours and now I'm home again.
Yep, I understand. We just something that I've been able to do here in the Watch Preserve, and something we're trying to do a little more of, are kind of destination trips where we meet with bigger collectors and look at their collections. And we just have this trip to go see that massive collection of vintage Hamilton stuff. And
Mm.
I was so excited to go out there and do it, but it kind of quickly became apparent to me. I'm like, man, like all of my day is going to be photos, videos, editing, repeat photos, and it's got to be like that on a dive trip too. Except you're having to gear up and kit up and then go do the dive and the physical things that you have to go through that, and then focus on the pictures. The time to enjoy the diving's probably got to be very small, right?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does have an effect on it. Over the course of doing it for a couple of years, I've tried to instill some like loose rules to make sure that that's not the only thing we're doing. Where if it's a 2 tank dive, we'll be like, all right, the first tank is all photos,
Mm-hmm.
and then the second one we're just gonna dive and enjoy it. So I try to balance it out a little bit.
Yeah. So I was looking at some of the articles that you wrote for Monochrome, and there are many, and the pictures are all awesome, and the words are all great. But I was wondering because some of those watches I have seen in your collection, and others I haven't. So is it
Mm.
kind of 50-50? Maybe you have had a watch that you're like, well, I haven't written a story on this, or how do you decide which ones you dive with?
It's kind of been all over the map. It'll either be I'll personally get a new watch and I'll be like, well, this is interesting. Like when I got the Zen
Yeah,
U50,
yeah.
I was like, I haven't seen anybody do an underwater story about that. So I just pitched it to Monochrome and they were like, yeah, that sounds cool. Let's do that.
Mm-hmm.
Other times they'll have an idea, or there's been a few like brand partnerships that they've done. We did a few Casio pieces that were like somewhat sponsored. I'm not in the financial department. I don't really know how that all works. But yeah, or I'll have an idea and I'll see something online. I'll be like, that's really interesting. We should try to get our hands on that. So it's been kind of across the board with the way these things have come to fruition.
Yeah, for sure. It's cool that you have the opportunity to get new stuff, but also probably kind of have another appreciation of pieces that you already own. You're spending a little bit kind of more like specialized time with in the water.
Yeah, for sure.
For me, one of my favorite stories that you wrote is like Rangiroa, right? With Blancpain.
Sure.
That's a pretty
Yeah.
cool one. Could you just talk a little bit about that, about what that was like? Because that is probably a little bit different than some of the normal stuff that you may have done, because that's kind of a far flung locale, right? I mean, that's a whole story
Yeah.
unto itself.
Yeah, that one. So I was on, I guess, Blancpain's radar because I'd previously done a story with the X Fathoms.
Mm-hmm.
The gigantic,
Huge,
all mechanical hockey puck
yeah,
piece that they have. So when we were finishing that one up, they asked if I would be interested in a diving opportunity that they had coming up the following year. I was like, yeah, of course. Let's just keep me posted. And I didn't really think anything was going to come of it, but then I heard from them. I think the following spring, or I'm not sure exactly, but it was a press trip, so sponsored by Blancpain, and it was a mix of journalists and like heavy duty Blancpain collectors. They flew us all out to Rangiroa, which is in French Polynesia, and it was coordinated around the release of the Tech Gombessa watch, which is a dive watch, but with the quirk of having a 3-hour count up bezel.
okay,
To be used by uh, rebreather divers,
right.
because on a rebreather, as you know, you can stay underwater for a much longer amount of time. So the 60 minutes on a regular dive watch is just not good enough anymore.
It doesn't work. Yeah. So for our
So
for
you need
our,
that.
our listeners that are not as clued into this as Derek and I are, normally when you're scuba diving, you're on an open circuit set of regulators where the air you expel comes out in the bubbles that you see from all scuba divers, but a closed circuit reuses that air that you breathe out, scrubs it, so it's safe to breathe back in. So like Derek's saying, you can stay underwater around 3 hours on a good CCR dive. It's very, very technical, takes a lot of training. And Derek, the people that you went out, the Tech Gombessa, that's a group of highly trained photographers, oceanographers, environmentalists, right? Led by Laurent Balesta, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
So he was there. They were all there. The coolest part of it was that they gave us a like intro to rebreather course
Yeah, cool.
to do there. So they took us out on a boat. Each diver was assigned an instructor, and we got, we'd had about 30 minutes of classroom beforehand explaining how all the different parts work or whatever, and then we got in the water with the rebreather, which I'll probably never have the opportunity to do again. And it's pretty crazy. The biggest takeaways I think for me were, one is that when you know how when you breathe in on your open circuit system, like your buoyancy, you go up a little bit,
Yeah.
and then as you exhale, you go down a little bit, and divers use that to compensate for where they want to be in the water. But with the closed circuit, since there's no new air being introduced, that doesn't happen. So when you breathe in, you just stay the same. So your buoyancy is like 100% controlled with your BC, which is interesting sensation to get used to after so much time of going up and down. And then also the biggest thing is that it's just dead silent, because you get used to the cacophony of bubbles and other people's bubbles, and like on a regular dive, that's all you hear is just bubbles. But when there's no bubbles, it's like it's this very eerie silent world. It's just has a whole different feeling to it. It's really cool.
Yeah, it is like the silent world, like the Cousteau.
Yeah,
yeah, truly.
Yeah, famously.
So how was the watch photography? I mean, was that a good watch to photograph underwater? Did it perform well?
It did. I mean, it performed just as it should. We weren't on any dives of more than 60 minutes, so I didn't really get to make sure that it counts all the way up to 3 hours. But I'll take their word for it on that. And they had photographers on site that did a majority of the underwater photography for that. So in my article, all the above water stuff are photos I took, but all the underwater stuff was taken by them. And they had, guys out there with the huge rigs and the strobes, the stretch outs, 6-foot wingspan style.
Geez, yeah.
So yeah, I didn't have to worry too much on that one, but it was an amazing experience, like altogether.
How many days were you out there for?
It was, I think, 4 days.
Oh, nice. It was a long time.
4 days. So there were like 2.5 days of diving, and then the rest was just watch release party and stuff like that. It was pretty fantastic.
That's so cool. What other trips are kind of in, if you had to pick top 3 for Monochrome, what would they be?
Outside of that, most of these trips have been, and that's also partly why I don't feel like, at least where I am, I could ever do it as like a full-time gig, but most of these trips have been planned by me, and I'll just do the watch as like on top of already going on this trip. Sure. So there hasn't really been much very, very exotic. It's been a lot of time in the Florida Keys.
Yep.
Because like I said, I grew up in Florida, so my parents still live down there. So I've got a nice Floridian home base to use as a jumping off point. So basically, they've pretty much all been either in the Keys or in that quarry that I mentioned before, which is in Pennsylvania, which is an old mine of some sort that naturally flooded, and then they turned into like a dive site, and they filled it with there's old airplanes in there and buses, and like there's a helicopter. It's pretty interesting.
Nice.
Like, that was my first like experience with quote unquote shipwrecks, even though they're put there by some man. But it's cool, and it's filled with those like zebra mussels, just kind of like the Great Lakes are. So the water is very clear due to that. So a lot of them were there, and mostly just the Florida Keys. I think I may have done one in Lake Michigan. But yeah, pretty much all around the U.S. except for that one Rangiroa trip.
Nice.
So I just try to do the best I can with what's at hand.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hey, I'm sure there's going to be more trips coming up sometime soon. There's got to be some stuff on the horizon. Fingers crossed. For you. What's a dream place to go? Like, if you could pick a dream watch to dive with and a dream dive location, what do you think they would be?
Oh man, put me on the spot here.
I know.
I think a dream watch that I've always thought about diving with would probably be like one of the solid gold Submariners.
Oh,
with the gold, the black dial, gold bracelet.
Yeah. That's not what I thought you were gonna say. I thought you were gonna go, I don't know, for Plo Prof or vintage 50 fathoms or something like that. That's
yeah, well, those would all be good, but there's always just been some mystique about the all gold dive watch.
Sure.
I think it might have been, was it Cole Pennington a few years ago that wrote an article. There's like a guy who just had that watch and dove with it for like his entire life, and it was all beat to hell.
Well, Sylvia Earle dives a gold Datejust too.
Datejust, right? Yeah. There's just something to that mystique of just being like the gold watch diver who doesn't really care that it's a gold watch.
Right. Scratch it up, ding it up. It's just a watch.
Yeah. As far as dream destination, I mean, there's not a single one. I've heard really great things about certain parts of Indonesia.
Oh yeah.
That I can't remember the name of right now. And actually, my brother lives in Jakarta, so I also very handily have a little home base there that I could maybe make it over to at some point.
Yeah, you do.
I've also been really interested in. Have you seen that super deep swimming pool in? I think
like
it's in
Abu
Dubai.
Dhabi, Dubai. Yeah.
One of those places. It's like a 200-foot deep swimming pool.
Yeah.
It seems kind of interesting.
See pictures of people because they put a bunch of like interesting things down there. So divers on like bicycles or playing chess down there.
I think I saw a pool table down there at some point.
A pool table, right? Yeah.
Hey.
I think for me, I would love to dive Raja Ampat. That's in Indonesia or Southeast Asia or someplace. I forget now. This is embarrassing. But it's one of those places that was at the brink of destruction, and then the ocean conservationist Sean Heinrichs, who's also a photographer and diver, really did a lot of work to turn it into a marine sanctuary and protect it. And now it's like just supposedly flourishing in life in the past couple of years, and that'd be a very cool place to dive. As far as watch, I would love, maybe it's because I'm working at a vintage shop now, but I'd love to dive something vintage. I think it would be so cool to do that. Vintage Aquastar would be pretty cool, I think. Maybe a Benthos or something like that. One of those big, purposeful divers from the 60s and 70s, I think, would be fun.
Yeah. A lot of those have been somewhat re-released lately, so you don't even have to worry about all the old seals and gaskets and whatnot.
Exactly. It's
and you get a similar experience.
We're kind of living in like the golden age of vintage-inspired re-releases. So for us divers that have always wanted to do that, you're right. This is kind of like, we've got our pick of the litter as far as what we want to dive with and what we want to use. Were there any watches? I'm curious because I always, I think about how when I dive, what I'm looking for wearing my watch, how I expect my watch to perform. Were there any watches that you took out that performed either worse or either way better than you kind of expected, as far as even how it just kind of looked underwater with legibility, or even something as basic as that?
There haven't really been very many. I mean, nowadays pretty much most watches are built pretty well. Even your, I imagine, I've never tried this, but I imagine even your like, $75 Invicta dive watch from the mall probably would be fine if you took it on a dive trip.
Yeah,
I would imagine, because they're all built pretty tough. So it kind of comes down to the fine details. But nothing. I've never had a watch flood. Knock on wood.
Mm-hmm.
But there's been a few where maybe the bezel is a little bit too hard to turn. Once you have a glove on or something like that. But nothing egregious. Probably the one that the one that immediately came to mind that I was the most impressed with was the Oris Aquis Pro, I believe it's called Pro. So Aquis Pro, but it's their super big. It's also kind of like the Blancpain in that it's like a hockey puck. It's way too big for me to wear anything other than diving, and it's all black and blacked out and yellow, and it has like a bezel locking mechanism on it.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah.
And also just the loom was fantastic on it. It felt more like a proper like dive tool, I think, than most of the other ones do, where it just, you put it right next to your computer and you wouldn't know that it wasn't part of the same unit,
Oris does a good job. I owned a Oris Aquis for 2 years or so, and I was overall really
Mm.
impressed with how it wore. You know, very slim, but it felt very capable and very durable at the same time. I wasn't a
Yeah.
diver at the time that I owned it, as much as I wanted to be. I wasn't living anywhere near the water. But they do a great job, and the Meistertaucher, the depth gauge that they have too, is also
Yeah.
a really really cool watch. I like
Mm-hmm.
I like when brands. I mean, we can talk. I think there's a lot of conversation to be had about should brands be innovating with new dive watches with new technologies, and or should they be doing reissues. Yeah, I think there's market for both and there's desire for both, but I like to see innovation. You know, the
Yeah.
reissues are really cool, but like we live now with access to so many different technologies and materials, and you know, making cool dive watches and doing interesting things, I think are the coolest way to go. I mean, you look at watches like the Pelagos, which is probably one of the best modern dive watches ever made, and I just lost my train of thought. Oh, we're doing.
Well,
Yeah.
let me ask you about as far as innovation though. Like I get your point, and I agree with you for sure. But like, are they? Is it? It's innovation as far as the watch goes, but it's not really. I guess it's not really innovation as far as diving goes, because there's no way it's ever going to compete, you know, with a modern dive computer or whatever.
Yeah.
But I agree that it's far more interesting when they do something new, whether it's like the that X Fathoms with the mechanical depth gauge,
Yep.
you know, which doesn't really make any difference when you're underwater or not, but just like conceptually it's cool. And the same with any depth gauge. There was that recent Singer watch. Did you see that one?
No, I didn't.
It was the one that I think they just announced at Watches and Wonders,
Mhm.
and it's you tell the time like on the side of the watch, and the entire face is like diving counters. There's like
Oh, that's
surface
cool.
time counter and multiple different like dive timers. So like their thing is that like it's focused on diving. Telling time is a secondary function.
So they literally made
So
like a mechanical dive computer, kind of.
yeah, right. I'm not sure if it has a depth gauge on it, but
Uh-huh.
it's got a bunch of timers. It's very cool. It's very expensive, so we'll probably never see one in real life,
Yeah.
but yeah, it is far more interesting when they are innovating on those things
But
rather than just
even things though like a mechanical depth gauge are not new. I mean, you know, Aqua Dive was making Bourdon tube gauges in the late 60s and 70s. So it's like
yeah.
you're right. We can say innovation, but I think really what we're both saying is new design,
Yeah,
design
right.
language. You know,
Or yeah, or just new toys to play with and look at.
yeah, exactly. Something new that wears a little differently that we can buy
Yeah.
and then go from there.
Yeah.
So I guess that's kind of a good segue to talk about your watch collection, which you got a lot of great stuff. You focus mostly on divers and sport watches, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's accurate.
Yeah. So have you dove every watch in your watch box?
Most of the divers at this point have been underwater at least one time. Yeah, I've gone back retroactively, and because I had like my SKXs and whatnot, and some Seikos before I started diving, so I've gone back and taken those. Just feel like you have to christen them or something a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I've tried. Because you do get a little. I mean, I guess it's like anything else. When you have a bunch of the same thing, you get a little bit bored with it, and you're like, well, what if I tried this, or what if I got a dress watch, and I'll do it, and I'll for maybe a month, I'll be like, hey, I'm a dress watch guy now, but then I'll be like, yeah, maybe I'm not, and I always end up back where I started, pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Do you have
Yeah.
a favorite watch to dive with out of your guys? Like I've got my very special Doxa, which is probably on 90% of my dives or so, because it's my baby, you know. Or do you like to rotate a lot, or do you kind of have one you would free choice gravitate to?
It's tough because so many of my dives in the past couple of years have had that extra, well, I gotta wear this and take photos of it because I have to write an article about it thing. So my when I get to take my own watches out, the times have been few and far between. But probably when I did my advanced open water certification, I have the Pelagos LHD, the left
Mm-hmm.
hand guy, and I wore that one because I was like, it's a chunky dive watch, and we're going all the way down to 85 feet today or
Yeah,
whatever. So I wore that. So that one probably has become my go-to like dive watch of my own whenever I have the time.
that's a good one. Gotta love a Tudor,
Yeah.
man. They're crushing it right now. Just
Yeah.
really delivering in that enthusiast space at a good price point, a good design. Yeah, they're doing a good job. A question
Yeah.
just occurred to me. I think it's easy for us to kind of sit here because we have dove with our watches and we do dive with our watches and just assume that everybody's kind of like on that same wavelength. And some people aren't. Some people are hesitant, I think, maybe to get in the water, and maybe much more so to take their expensive timepiece in the water. So if there's anybody who's listening who's kind of on the fence about going diving with their watches or anything like that, what might you say to somebody, as somebody with lots of dives, as somebody who's dove with a lot of different watches at a lot of different price points and a lot of different brands? What would you say to somebody who is on the fence about taking their watches on a dive?
I mean, I would say just do it. Just do it, man. Like, as scary as it can be, and I've had some watches that were not mine. For instance, that Blancpain X Fathoms that has a hefty price tag.
Yeah.
So, jumping off the back of a boat, in rocky conditions in that was a little nerve-wracking, but the worst thing I think I've ever had happen to a watch in the water is I maybe scuffed the crystal a little bit, banging it on a tank or a bulkhead of a shipwreck or something like that. Um, and I think you always do. It's almost a little cliche, but you always do then have those memories attached to that watch when you're sitting on your couch and whatever and looking at your watch. You're like, oh yeah, so that time and even if you do get a little scratch on it, but like this is from the time I was in a shipwreck and in the Caribbean, where it's like, well, it's a pretty cool thing to be able to remember more often.
Yeah, it's a much cooler story than I banged it on the copier at the office, right?
Right, or the door frame, which always gets in my
Which
way.
we have all done that. Yeah, exactly. For me, it's really like it's kind of the same reason why I've grown so much recently to like vintage watches. And you're right, maybe it is a cliche, but it's true. It's that story
Sure.
that you put into them, because at the end of the day, I mean, we say this all the time, right? Nobody needs a mechanical watch. Nobody needs it. We have our phone. We have our iPhone watches. What are they called? Apple watches.
Yes.
But these mechanical little tidbits, have stories and have character and heart. And for me, when you can wear them on an adventure or something as cool as getting in the water and going on some dives or hiking or mountain climbing or whatever, then that's when you should be wearing them, in best of cases. No.
Yeah.
You mountain
Agreed.
climb too, right? Do you climb? You hike, right?
Uh, Not professionally, just whenever I can. Yeah, but I live in the Northeast right now, so up in the Hudson Valley, New
Mm-hmm.
York. So there's a lot of good, small to medium sized mountains and hills, or uh, whatever you want to call them. So there's a lot of good stuff out here, but I make it out whenever I can. But I wouldn't call myself an avid hiker by any means,
Yeah, I've always wanted.
lest I accidentally offend people.
I feel like hikers are probably not the most easily offended people out there.
Yeah, probably
I feel
not.
like they're probably pretty chill.
Yeah.
So we're wrapping up. We try to shoot for about 40 minutes or so. So,
Okay.
um, but you have a move coming up, right? I've probably caught you in the middle of packing and pre-packing and
Yeah.
everything.
It's kind of a mess. Yep.
You are becoming a transplant out to the Midwest, right?
Correct. Yeah, my girlfriend and I have been spending. This is another symptom of the pandemic. We started going. So once work from home became a thing, and I wasn't tied to an office in Manhattan anymore, we started thinking like, well, where else could we go? And we started visiting Madison, Wisconsin, in the summer times, just kind of on a whim, and just after doing some research, and we're like, we've never been out that way before. Let's just go see what it's all about. And we kind of become quite fond of it, especially in the summertime. There's a lot of like boating activities and outdoor stuff, and it's just like it's a whole different like lifestyle than New York is, I think.
Sure, yeah.
So we've been going out there for about 3 summers in a row now, 3 maybe 4, and we're just like, we just keep going. So maybe we just go for a little bit longer and see if it sticks. So we got an apartment, so we're going to be there for at least 1 year now, and we'll see how it goes. Could be for a year, it could be forever. Who knows?
Yeah, you could be a full-time Midwesterner now.
I could. Maybe a lot more Great Lakes content coming your way.
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you have anything coming up or anything that you'd like to do? I mean, Great Lakes diving for sure. It's a different kind of diving. It's cold. It's dark.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in Lake Michigan a couple of times, and Superior once, but I very much enjoy the little bit colder and all the shipwrecks and whatnot. I've always been a little bit more of a shipwreck guy than a colorful fish guy as far as diving goes. So it should be good, and it'll be nice to be about an hour away from all that.
Yeah, for sure. And you're going to be out there for Wind Up Chicago in the summer?
Correct.
Very cool. Very cool. So I wish I could make it out for that. I always have opera jobs all throughout the summer. But for anybody who's not familiar, the Wind Up's a huge festival. A lot of independent brands and micro brands, and now a lot of the larger ones are getting involved as well too out there. And there's a meetup of divers that happens kind of right before the festival every summer, called Wind Up in a Lake, which is now becoming quite a thing. I mean, Benris kind of sponsored the second one, and the Marathon just did the one out in San Francisco. So it's really cool for me, and I'm sure for you too, to see the diving world become really truly interconnected with watches in such a strong way.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely nice to see more interest. So I'm glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I look forward to seeing lots of Great Lake stories coming out on Monochrome. Taking X Watch out into the lake and doing some cool content there.
Yeah, I'm gonna definitely try to make that happen sooner than later.
Yeah. Well, hey Derek, thanks so much for taking some time away from packing or from work to hang out with me for a little bit. It's a pleasure to have you on. Where can the people find you? Are you on Instagram or?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. It's just my full name, Derek Haager, and that's pretty much it. I'm on some of the others, but pretty much only on Instagram.
Yeah, and Monochrome, of course. We'll post up all the links to your articles on there so everybody can read your stuff. It's good stuff.
I appreciate it. It's very kind.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks again for coming to hang out for a bit, and I'll talk with you soon. Have a good week, man.
All right. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.